Morning. I hope y'all enjoyed your coffee. Mayor Sam Liccardo is the 65th mayor of San Jose, elected in November of 2014. I recently finished reading the book, If Mayors Ruled the World. Barber asserts that cities and the mayors who run them are primary incubators of the innovations that shape our planet and our universe. Mayor Liccardo has cultivated innovation in science, technology, and education in San Jose with programs like 1,000 Hearts for 1,000 Minds, and continues to support efforts like the NewSpace conference that are helping to drive the space renaissance in this city and in the world. Please join me in welcoming Mayor Sam Liccardo.
Thank you, Hannah, and thank you, and good morning. It's great to see folks here for the 8th year now of this conference in San Jose, and we're thrilled to host you. We love having you, and we love having your tax dollars, so please stay here and spend lots of money. This has been a really exciting time, I understand, in the space industry, and I think many of you know of the roots of this industry here in the Valley. Back in the day when there was a lot of federal money in this, clearly the industry has transformed now, and it's primarily a private sector venture. And that's where Silicon Valley certainly does best, and that's where San Jose has done best. We are thrilled to have many great companies here in San Jose that have been deeply involved over the last few years in forging new frontiers. And I just want to thank Hannah and all the folks who put this effort together. We know this is an exciting time. We want San Jose to be in the middle of this. Our great companies are here doing incredible things, and we want to support them. And if you just happen to have a company that's looking for a home, don't hesitate to give us a call, and we'll help you find a space to scale here in San Jose in a place where you'll be among the most innovative minds in the world. Please have a wonderful conference. We look forward to great things happening from the collection of minds right here. Have a great day.
Jeff Grayson. We sell it on flight. So, since we're going to go ahead and jump in here. My name is Bruce Pittman. So I'm the Chief System Engineer at the Space Portal at the NASA Ames Research Center. And I'm going to moderate the panel this morning. And we have an interesting topic to talk about. So I want to give you a little history lesson. So I'm going to start off, and then Glenn's going to fill in the details here. But I want to take you back 100 years. March 3rd, 1915. A long time ago. A lot of changes happened since then. So back then, there was the 63rd Congress was coming to an end. It would end the next day. And so there was a rider that was attached to the Navy Appropriations Bill that year, which had this thing called the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, and with a grand total budget of $5,000. And this was authorized for 5 years for a group of 12 individuals that would report to the president and advise him on the aeronautics in the United States. And the situation was, in 1903, another history lesson, December 17th, 1903, the Wright brothers, Kitty Hawk, first heavier than air flight with a person. Okay, so you're saying, hey, this is a big deal. That must have changed the world. Nada, nothing, zip. One, it was slightly some part of the paranoia of the Wright brothers, but it was also, since the government-funded program, which was Samuel P. Langley, had ended up in the Potomac right before that, everybody had gotten kind of turned off to aviation. And so the US government didn't buy the first airplanes for almost 5 years. And it was 1908 before we bought the first airplanes. And then I think we bought 2. Well, the Wright brothers, were a little bit frustrated by this. And so what they did is they went over to Europe. So in 1908, they took off for Europe. They got invited over there. And so they went over and flew around Paris. And that took the continent by storm. The Europeans were very excited about this and very open to this. And so the next year in 1909, the British started 2 things. One was the British Advisory Committee for Aeronautics and the British Royal Aircraft Factory were both set up. And that kind of set the pace in Europe for what was going on. And so, fast forward to 1912-ish period, a lot of people were looking at what's going on in Europe and say, hey, we're behind. We're losing our edge here if or we've already lost it. And so the question was, what do we do about it? So that's what led to the foundation of the NACA. By the time World War I started, which was in July 1914, we were hopelessly behind. The Europeans, the British, the Russians, and everybody had been putting far more money and everything into aircraft than we were. And so the NACA was established to help answer that challenge. Make America get back into the game, become a world leader again, and fundamentally understand both the science and the technology of aeronautics and flight. And so, as I said, Glenn's going to give us the details of that. But and it was successful. The NACA was able to do a lot of really incredible things, both on the management side. One of the things that had greatly inhibited this development in America was this big patent fight between the Wright brothers and Glenn Curtiss that kind of brought everything to a halt, so that the NACA helped broker this deal with what this establishment was called the Manufacturers Aircraft Association, and a cross-licensing agreement there, and a royalty fee arrangement that kind of broke that logjam and really allowed for innovation to come back to the United States. And so they had some real successes with both the technology and with things like fundamental aerodynamics and the airfoils and cowlings and everything that they applied to aircraft navigation, weather, and particularly icing was a big problem back in those days. And the NACA did a tremendous amount of work in those areas. And laboratories were established. First, the Langley Laboratory in Hampton, Virginia in 1920, then Ames in 1939, and then what was called the Lewis Research Center in 1940, and then finally the Flight Research Center down in Mojave. But there were some challenges as well. So what we'd like to do in this panel is to look back at kind of the last 100 years and say, what have we learned in this period of time? What happened, the good, the bad, the not so good, and what can we learn from that as we go forward? And then, in 1958, when NASA was established by Congress, they rolled pretty much all of NACA into NASA, and so NASA was kind of built around the kernel of this previous organization, and they carried over some things. And one thing that I want to do that Gary's going to talk about at the end here, and there was one little line in the NASA authorization. It was kind of a throwaway line at the end that was very important for what we're trying to do right now, and it's called Other Transactions Authority. So what Congress gave to NACA or to NASA, which at the time no other government agency had, was this Other Transactions Authority. When a contract or a grant was not appropriate, NASA had the ability to use this Other Transactions Authority. And so we're going to talk about what that has enabled and what we've been able to do with that. So what we're going to do is we're going to go kind of start off with Glenn Bugos is the historian at NASA Ames in the history office at NASA Ames, and he's going to give us kind of the background of this. Then we're going to have Dr. Michelle Gates, is the program director of the Asteroid Redirect mission at NASA headquarters, and she's going to talk about some of the innovative things that they're trying to do with that mission, and kind of look at new ways of doing things to try to bring these kinds of exciting missions about. Then we're going to have Jeff Grayson, who's the co-founder and chairman of the board of XCore Aerospace, and a very thoughtful person in these matters. And so I was really glad that Jeff agreed to be here, because I know he's done a lot of thinking on this, and he actually still uses the NASA TMs and the NACA TMs that came out in the olden days as part of his company. And finally, Gary Martin is the director of the partnership directorate at NASA Ames. And he's going to talk about some of the exciting things that are going on right now, and some of the new things that NASA is trying to do to enhance partnerships in the way that industry, government, and academia can work together better. So on that note, I'm going to turn it over to Glenn, and we'll get this started. So we're going to do some brief presentations from this. I'm going to start off with some questions, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. So hope you enjoy.
Thanks, Bruce. That was actually a great introduction to the history of the NACA. So show of hands, how many people in here had actually heard of the NACA before Bruce mentioned it? That's great. Actually, the numbers of engineers that know about the NACA is probably greater than the number of historians, because the technical reports are still in such wide use. So because it's the centenary of the NACA, the NASA history community is taking this opportunity to sort of ask the question about whether or not the NACA, as they say in Lion King, still lives in you. It's a cause to reflect on the culture of the NACA and whether or not there is a legacy of it within NASA today. So the NACA lasted a fairly short period of time, 43 years, from 1915 to 1958, and it's been gone longer than that, almost 57 years. Yet it lives, I think, in memory and in legacy, because it embodies some essential government functions that can hide in other organizations, but can never completely go away as long as there is space to explore and people to make money doing so. So here's a quick history. Bruce mentioned its humble beginnings. The word committee in its name was actually very meaningful throughout its lifetime, but especially during World War I, when the advisory in the name was also very meaningful. Of the 12 members, 12 of them came, of the 12 members in the NACA committee, half of them were from the military services or other government agencies related to aircraft, like the Weather Bureau or the National Bureau of Standards. The other half were academic experts. The military came with questions about why their aircraft were underperforming, and the other members advised them on a specific solution. They did some important contracted studies, as with William Durand at Stanford University, who did a parameter variation study on the effectiveness of propellers. The NACA opened its first laboratory in 1920 in Langley, Virginia, and soon the NACA became associated with wind tunnels and other great experimental facilities. By the late 1920s, the culture of the NACA shifted. The policy business was turned over to the Commerce Department, and the NACA began focusing more on assessing and advancing the state-of-the-art in aircraft technology. The NACA support of airmail reflects this transition. Early on, the NACA advocated airmail as a top government priority, as a killer app for getting the industry started. The Army started airmail with disastrous results. The Post Office took over in 1918. By 1924, they were flying airmail around the clock, coast to coast, and with the best safety record of any air operation. That's the point when Congress turned it over to private contractors, who then made a lot of money on it. That safety record in airmail was built largely because NACA surveyed the problems they were having and gave advice on operational issues, weather patterns, navigation aids, airport layouts, as well as tweaks to the aircraft that they had to use. World War I aircraft were still being used, but the NACA did a complete survey of problems with the aircraft, and they were very well understood. The aircraft were, and that's when the NACA began to realize that its role in the ecosystem of aircraft may be in constructing an architecture of aeronautical knowledge. After airmail went private in the late 1920s, the NACA more actively got involved in aircraft design. They did the parameter variation studies leading to the NACA airfoil series. All the dry cleanup work best reflected in the streamline engine cowling led ultimately to the airframe revolution embodied in the DC-3 in the early 1930s. Metal construction, stressed skin, retractable landing gear, variable pitch propellers. That's the point when air transport started to take off. World War II was all about building new laboratories, Ames in Cleveland, and solving problems with aircraft needed for the war. One example of the NACA style of research continuing during this time period was in de-icing, for which it won a Collier Trophy. Lou Rodert at Ames studied the conditions, designed a suite of thermal de-icing technologies, and validated them so that they could be applied to any type of aircraft. In the post-war period, the NACA returned to the culture it had developed in the 1930s, first to figure out the new technologies that had been created during the war, like jet engines, and more importantly, how to integrate jet engines into airframes. Missiles were going supersonic, and the aerodynamic analysis the NACA did for them was applied to new supersonic aircraft. Low-speed aerodynamics remained important, and the NACA did much of the aerodynamic constructional analysis that allowed helicopter firms to proliferate. So why did the NACA die in 1958? The NACA did a lot of work anticipating the leap into space, but the aftermath of Sputnik left it vulnerable to political attack. Specifically, the military had created an ecosystem of firms that provided research on contract. Also, there was the illusion of program management. The NACA had extensive experience in program management. The many wind tunnels that they had built were incredibly sophisticated with huge metal hulls matched to very precise instrumentation. But the NACA helped people build things that flew. It didn't build them itself. Furthermore, program management and systems engineering were invented by the military ballistic missile programs in the mid-1950s, specifically to assert politically that they could manage technological complexity. So when the federal government needed to build civilian rockets, it subsumed the NACA into a new organization. The four labs, Ames, Langley, Lewis, and Dryden, continued to validate space technology while continuing the sort of fundamental research the aerospace industry had grown dependent upon, reflected in rotorcraft and supersonic transports as well as other things. The NACA Advisory Council calls itself a vestige of the NACA main committee. Otherwise, to answer the question, does the NACA live in us, depends on what you look for, and that's primarily in the NACA culture. So the NACA culture can be broken into three broad categories: industrial intelligence, epistemic community, and fundamental engineering. Epistemic community means that the NACA focused less on generating new knowledge and more on validating the knowledge that they already had. It was a show me mentality. They were manufacturing certainty. It wasn't about what you know, but about how you know it, and they were building a community of trust. Of course, bringing technological debate to a close required its own ingenuity. Reliable knowledge others could use, perhaps allowed other people to make money on that technology. Fundamental engineering means that they solve problems using whatever means they had: mathematical, laboratory experiment, flight test. Often mechanics solved a problem in bending metal in a wind tunnel, and then math skills expressed what had happened later. When rivets got in the way of a useful boundary layer, they engineered better rivets. But industrial intelligence, I think, was key. First, the NACA was a committee made up of nested committees. An executive committee met weekly and made decisions on expenditures of money. A main committee met twice yearly, set policy. Technical committees surveyed broad areas of technology, and subcommittees tackled specific problems. What these did very well was gather intelligence on the state of the art, and where they found broad problem areas, they focused their attention. The overarching goal of the NACA at the time was to define the problems that the industry was confronting. They also had other means of gathering intelligence. They built offices in New York and Santa Monica and Paris with staff that did nothing but visit aircraft manufacturers and ask them what the problems were and how the NACA labs might help. Remember, this was a time when there were hundreds of firms building aircraft, some of them moving into aircraft from on directions, like spin-offs of bicycle shops. The NACA also held annual inspections, visits of hundreds of people from the military services and industry, where they came, saw the facilities, learned what the NACA could do for them, as long as the military sponsors of the NACA agreed. The NACA also commuted through their technical report system. The most important papers went through several iterations as the questions were refined. The work was double-checked ferociously at the different laboratories. The reports were available to anyone. The idea was that the NACA did not solve problems just for one manufacturer. The ideas they advanced could be useful to all aircraft manufacturers. People will say that the NACA was a midwife for the aircraft industry. In fact, it supported the government customers and regulators of the industry. The NACA supported the public interest, first indirectly. The NACA supported the industry was profound, but it was always indirect. So I think an interesting compare and contrast with the NACA was the Guggenheim Foundation, an effort by a rich philanthropist, Harry Guggenheim, to take some of his father's mining dollars and advance the state of the art in civil transport. Harry Guggenheim wanted to fly by aircraft. He started this fund in 1926, disbanded it in 1930 when he was appointed ambassador to Cuba. It never had a lot of money, $3 million at the time, which basically equates to about $30 million today. But he used it to do things that the NACA couldn't do, like invest in undergraduate education programs. He gave 7 grants to university departments that remain some of the leaders in the field. He sponsored safe airplane competitions where 27 different manufacturers tried to make aircraft that would be very stable at low air speeds and solve some of the problems in shifting from airmail to transport. He hired Charles Lindbergh to tour the country and improve the public image of pilots and of aviation. And he funded Robert Goddard's early work in liquid multi-stage rockets, which at that point was too dreamy-eyed for the government to begin to fund. These were all the sort of things that a philanthropist could do, but he also pushed the government into new areas. The model airway that he developed also had a model weather service, which the U.S. Weather Bureau then took over. The work that he did in aviation medicine underlay what the FAA later did in licensing of pilots. He built his own laboratory, much like the NACA laboratories. It's focused specifically on designing instrumentation for flying. So in almost any case, when the NACA was transforming from a policy role into a fundamental engineering role in the late 1920s, I looked at Guggenheim, the philanthropist, as sort of a compare and contrast in how they could build their own program. And I wanted to stand with some thoughts on Harvey Allen. I think most of you will know that Harvey Allen was the aerodynamic genius that came up with the blunt body concept. The blunt body concept was first demonstrated in 1957 when the Army Ballistic Missile Agency shot a Jupiter C up into space and the nose cone returned safely. It had a rounded nose, the blunt body shape that Harvey Allen and his crew at Ames had been working on. Allen's story actually goes back to 1947 when he began seeing hypersonic effects in the wind tunnel. By 1951, the big problem, of course, was returning ballistic missiles to Earth. The services had been trying with their specific programs and failing and coming up with a viable design. Allen's toolkit included analysis of boundary layers. It also included a very staunch public service mentality. What he sought to do was aggressive generalization. In a eureka moment, he realized that the blunt shape would force heating into the airstream where it could pass over the entry vehicle, and he expressed this idea in calculus, just enough to show that it could apply to any different type of entry vehicle. But he spent most of his time building facilities that validated that particular technology. Ballistic ranges, which showed it could be aerodynamically stable, arc jets to look at heat transfer, free flight models that were done on the X-17, looking at flight test data for his blunt body concept. Today, Ames continues to invent new reentry technologies like the Pika heat shield material, using many of the facilities that Allen built or started to build in the late 1950s. Allen's work, I think, embodies what the NACA was all about. He was not seeing years into the future, developing low-tier technologies. He was making specific problems general to everyone. His math helped in reentry body design for everyone, and he validated his ideas so that the military would feel confident in putting it in use of the public interest. In his moment of fame in the late 1950s, the press often asked Allen why he didn't join a firm that could pay him more money. And he talked about having the freedom to work out grand problems in the NACA. And he talked about that what he did was an essential government function. And at the time, almost everybody in the American aerospace industry agreed. Thanks very much.
morning. I did bring a few slides with me. It's an honor to be here. This is my first time at your conference, but I've wanted to come for some number of years, so it's really a pleasure. And I look forward to hearing all of the conversation and discussion through the rest of the day. My name is Michelle Gates. I'm the Program Director for the Asteroid Redirect Mission at NASA headquarters. And I'll bring a little bit of our status and then the discussion about how we're applying lessons from the past and history to what we're going to be doing in the future. This set of graphics, images that you're looking at is our concept of what crewed operations might look like in cislunar space, approximately 50,000 miles above the surface of the moon, beyond the surface of the moon, 10 years from now. And this concept is actually under development by Johnson Space Center and is the crewed mission of the Asteroid Redirect Mission. Sorry, this graphic here, my apologies. So you see crew working in tandem with robotics on an asteroidal mass that is within the cislunar gravitational system, however, farther than we have ever taken humans ever before. So the Asteroid Redirect Mission actually consists of substantial activities across 3 mission directorates at NASA. We're trying to leverage significant ongoing work across the agency in addition to bringing in the innovations and products external to the agency and our international partners as well. The top row pertains to the Science Mission Directorate's active work in looking for potentially hazardous asteroids. The second row is a robotic redirect mission, which we have selected a mission concept for earlier this year. Actually traverses to a large asteroid in the near to the Earth, so near Earth asteroid, utilizing an advanced solar electric propulsion system, obtains a large cohesive multi-ton mass from that asteroid, performs a deflection demonstration of the large asteroid, and then ferries that multi-ton mass back to a stable orbit around the moon. And then 10 years from now, in the graphic that you've just seen, our astronauts would travel further than ever before to select, extract, and return samples of the asteroidal mass with them in the Orion capsule. Here's another graphic for your perusal. So at the end, in terms of the end game, 10 years from now, there would be several technologies on board this integrated mission which would contribute to our plans for taking humans to Mars in a sustainable, affordable approach. Which can be articulated. You can see the strategies and discussions in some other products, and I have a chart at the end which provides kind of a strategy graphic for this plan forward. But in particular to this mission, the advanced solar electric propulsion technologies that will comprise a 40 kilowatt system able to ferry a multi-ton mass, which we'll demonstrate utilizing this boulder, through interplanetary trajectory low gravitational field systems. The Orion space capsule, which is in this graphic attached to the solar electric propulsion-based robotic spacecraft. The robotic capture and manipulation system consisting of a contact and restraint system and several, 6 degrees of freedom, 2 arms to obtain the asteroidal mass and return it to the system, and then provide support to the crew during the crewed sampling mission. Our EVA capabilities, 50,000 miles above the surface of the moon in deep space, our ability to operate the integrated vehicle stack with all of the moments of inertia and thermal constraints, communications constraints involved in performing a mission like this. And I hope that you could see yourself in this image. We are looking for and have solicited twice over the last 2 years for commercial partnerships for the robotic mission as well as the crewed mission 10 years from now. Done the same through international means and investigating and examining ways in which we could extend this mission to provide both benefits to industry as well as future benefits to our journey to Mars in a sustainable way. This is the agency's current, I would say, strategic image that describes both the multi-mission directorate commitment and plan for sustainable human missions to Mars, as well as the NASA milestones and missions that are defined and planned in this strategy, including the International Space Station, which Dr. Newman talked about in detail in her remarks. So that's kind of all I have. Okay, thanks.
So I don't have slides, so I'll just speak from the couch if that works. And it's a rare pleasure for those of you who know me and what I've been doing in the industry for a while. You'll understand how rare a pleasure it is for me to get up and talk about one of government's great success stories and one of the things that it truly has done superlatively well in history, which is the NACA. It is the rare day that I go through my job and don't crack open an NACA report. Almost all roads lead back to the NACA and anything fundamental that you do in space and air technology. If I want to work on Flutter and I want to figure out how to do calculations, I open an NACA report. If I want to streamline something, I open an NACA report. If I want to go to a wind tunnel, chances are it's an NACA wind tunnel. If it's not, it's an Air Force wind tunnel or another government facility wind tunnel. We had, when we were going through the landing gear design on the ship that I'm working on now, the FAA standards are really vague on how you handle ships that have a big difference between takeoff and landing weight. Some of the standards in the FARs are a little unclear whether they're talking about the takeoff or landing weight. And for an airplane, that's not such a large difference that it's really all that important. For a vehicle with a high mass ratio, it's very important. I asked the FAA where those numbers came from, they didn't know. I went looking around and finally found the NACA report that I clearly, word for word, all the FARs have been lifted out of. Unfortunately, they explain where the numbers came from. So I was able to figure out which one of those were meant to apply to what by going back to the original research, which was done because they instrumented an airplane and went out and landed it and found out how the landing gear reacted. I really like the phrase that the historian used of fundamental engineering because it's a role that we don't have a way to play right now. There are still academics doing fundamental research. What does the physics tell you? And there are lots of organizations, public and private, doing applied engineering. How do we solve this particular problem that I have today? But NACA filled a role without which we probably wouldn't be here today, without which you probably wouldn't have won World War II, without which many other things wouldn't have happened, of how do we solve broadly applicable classes of problems that are useful across significant sectors of the aviation industry that are in some sense pre-competitive. It lifts all of the boats of all the people who are going to use that research, not one particular segment of the industry versus another segment of the industry. And it's not, it would not have been if the NACA thought of the national. The purpose of the NACA was to build the planes the United States was going to fly and operate. It, of course, would have focused on the problems that were unique to the planes that it were going to build, fly, and operate. Instead, its purpose was make sure that the industrial base of the United States is the most competitive in the world. And that was a very different mission and a very powerful mission. And I don't know where we'd be without it. And I'm not exaggerating. It's really the rare day that I don't find myself opening an NACA report. And when I do open a NASA report, chances are it was printed before 1975. Because, then Apollo came, and they all stopped doing that kind of work for a while because there was the equivalent of a war on. And then, as they were about to retire, there was a great burst of research of all the ideas they had. They were too busy to work on how we were going to the moon, and then they retired. Okay, so what happened in the 1970s? Computers were the big thing, and if you open the NASA report from 1975 on, chances are you see a nice set of dot matrix printed tables in the back that's the run from their latest computer program that they want to tell you about. Well, that computer program is long obsolete. You couldn't get it anyway. It's probably written in Fortran, doesn't run anymore. And the results are very specific. And although NASA continues to do a lot of very valuable research, more and more of the effort is focused more and more narrowly on solving the specific problems that NASA has to do as an agent. NASA views itself as an agent that's going to do certain things in space. And the research that they fund, or the applied engineering that they fund, is about how to solve the problems that they have as actors. And the great progress that's already been talked about, I'm sure you'll hear more about it, about partnering more with commercial industry is great progress. But it's still progress in how can we, NASA, better use the capabilities of you, the industry, to help us, NASA, do what we, NASA, need to do. It's not about how can we, the government agency, use our skills and expertise to improve the competitiveness of the American industry. The blackest day in American aeronautic research was a few years ago when the NASA Technical Report Server went dark. And all the NACA reports, which everybody in the planet has had for so long, were no longer accessible through that service. And in the time that it had been up, all the libraries that I'm familiar with that had all the NACA reports took them out of public access and put them in the archives because why bother? They're all online now. That database is back up, but still at least half the reports I used to have copies of that I go look for aren't on there. As if, for example, I went looking for a lightweight structures report that happened to be on how airships were designed. I don't think airships are highly militarily useful these days. Nevertheless, that report is no longer accessible on the NASA Technical Report Server. Now, if I spoke Chinese, the Chinese have a complete archive of all the NASA Technical Reports that's up, but it's not an English language searchable index, so I find it more or less convenient to use. The other thing so that role today is not being filled. There's no agency that serves the applied engineering role that's useful out there. And if you think that's because there's not fundamental work to do, you're just wrong. You know, in 5 minutes, we can easily think of 5 years worth of work, of fundamental work that needs to be done that would enable whole sectors of the US emerging aerospace economy to be more advanced, more competitive, more useful, but nobody's funding it, and the companies can't do it because it's too long payoff for them to fund individually. So it's just not being done, at least not in this country. The other thing that was touched on lightly by the historian that I want to focus on a little harder is there's another function that was done by the NACA, which the need to do this in the current industrial base exists, but is not yet screamingly urgent. And that is this brokering of the patent cross-licensing issue. Every industry that I know about has had to go through a crisis like that. In the semiconductor industry that I used to work on, we eventually worked out a modus vivendi that we used to call weighing the patents, where you basically stack up, every company cross-licenses their patents to everybody else. You pile your patents on a scale, you figure out which way it tips, and that defines who pays who how much for the cross-license. In the aircraft industry, we have the Aircraft Manufacturers Association, that was brokered by the NACA. That's a very hard deal to work out between the companies because it verges on anti-competitive behavior to get into this discussion about how are we going to let each other use our intellectual property. But it's impossible for one company to have all the good ideas. What's keeping that from being a critical problem right now is that most of the good ideas happened before 1970. So they're all out there in the public domain, and all these startup companies can use all that prior art, and that's why we're getting on with life. But now that new work is going on and new inventions are being made, you're starting to see companies making noises about things that most people thought were obvious, but they managed to patent it. So now we're going to figure out some reason why we can keep company B from using that idea. And that's exactly the kind of thing that sort of the aircraft industry in the United States put on hold until after World War I. And that's something we're going to have to do something about. And it's very difficult without a government partner to get over that kind of hurdle, and there's no government partner charter to do that kind of thing. So it's work that desperately needs to be done. I find myself all the time at conferences like this saying the phrase, If only we had a national agency that was chartered to do fundamental research in space for things that might be useful. And it's conscious that I do that because I keep finding that problem over and over again. It's not true that NASA's charter to take over from the NACA kept it from doing that. What kept it from doing that was the Apollo program. It was remade again as a national agency to fly things in space, not to assist the aerospace industry in being able to fly things in space. But I want to close with reading the opening purpose of NASA and the NASA Act. I will let you judge for yourself to what extent this characterizes the NASA we have today. But this is in law, this is what the purpose of NASA is. The improvement of the usefulness, performance, speed, safety, and efficiency of aeronautical and space vehicles. And I'm skipping over some of the intermediate purposes here just for my point. And the preservation of the role of the United States as a leader in aeronautical and space science and technology, and in the application thereof to the conduct of peaceful activities within and outside the atmosphere, and the making available of agencies directly concerned with national defense of discoveries that have military value or significance. And I leave it to all of you to decide for yourselves to what extent the agency we have today performs that purpose.
Let's see, so I'm hoping that I have a good news story for that. But we're in a time of change, and I do want to talk about why I'm here, why I work for NASA, why I'm at Ames, because I think it has a lot to do with the NACA and things that are changing within NASA right now. So I grew up in the 60s. We stopped class and we watched every launch. We knew how each launch was getting us closer and closer to going to the moon. We all knew we'd get there at some point. And space was just part of our lives. So it was hard not to be excited about it. Star Trek, the Jetsons, we're going to live on the moon. I want to be one of those people. So I've been thinking, all in my early 20s, and things that that's what I'm going to do. And then there's big disappointment, after the space race, things go down. We're not moving so quickly, and it was hard to tell exactly where we were moving to. So when I came to NASA, I got excited. I was in the manned space program in the research areas, and I was lucky enough in my career to have worked at enough places to set me up for the best job I ever had, which was looking at and working with some of the best people from all the centers. I was at NASA headquarters. And what we were doing, it started in '99, but I didn't join the group until 2000, was looking at how humans could actually go to the moon and how we could go to Mars. Because I don't know how many of you even realize this, but before 2004, we weren't even allowed to talk about it at NASA. If we had anything about technology that would be like for a lunar suit or lunar habitat, it was taken out of the budget. We were told to focus on the space station. And we weren't even allowed to make pictures about what people on Mars might do. So, but a lot of lucky people, including myself, I got to lead a group that was kind of looking at these things and what kind of technologies would we need to put in place that would help science, that would help the space station, but was actually laying the foundation to go to the moon and Mars. So actually this group kept changing its name so no one could track us down. And we had a lot of fun doing it, and we were very successful. But the culmination of that, I became the space architect working directly with the administrator and the deputy administrator. And we put together a strategy with other leaders at NASA headquarters and around the agency that became the Vision for Space Exploration in 2004. It was only after President Bush said that in January of 2004 that we were actually allowed to start talking about going to the moon and Mars and putting it back into our budget. And actually,
the kinds of things we take for granted now, as far as our long-term architectures, now we can start actually looking at how are we going to do that and making progress towards it. So I was very happy. We all celebrated for a long time. But then the reality came in. You know, it's very expensive, and is it a priority? And so we've had our eye on Mars. We've been looking at it for decades. And so we had this Moon, Mars, and beyond architecture. But then, because of priorities and realities, it changed to a Moon focus. And then, as you know, we're now still have our eye on Mars, but it's not a Moon focus for our first step. We're going to do an asteroid, which is a very good way to test out the technologies and to get us set, ready to go to Mars in deep space. But because of this changing way, it made me fall back on work that we had done during those days when we were putting together the foundation. And actually, some of the work, I was talking to David this morning about some of the work we did at MIT. And one of the things we were looking at, especially in the early 2000s, how do we make an architecture that would last? How do we make it past the elections? How do we make it past new management? How do we make it something that's going to happen, much like we knew we were going to go to the moon during the 70s, the 60s. So it came back a really easy answer. I have a diagram that shows feedback loops and everything, but the answer was so clear, was that you had to have industry in space. You had to have new markets. People had to be making money in space. Because if you had industry in space and people were making money with new ways and new business plans, they talked to their congressmen. They helped focus the move of civilization out off this planet. And they give to an architecture that NASA and its missions want to accomplish. So I was really happy to see, we have COTS. That was the first big experiment. That was hard for a lot of people. It's been quite a success, where we start depending on industry to provide us with services that they can do. That, now we're actually using it for space station, and we're seeing so many new business cases coming up. So to me, we're right at this cusp where we're not quite there yet, but we're certainly at the very beginning of it. And you here in this room are the ones making it happen. But the reason that I came to Ames and why I do partnerships is more about what was just said, what Jeff said, and how Glenn talked about the NACA, was that NASA spends a lot of money on creating new technologies that we need for our missions. But that technology is open to you. You don't have to go reinvent the wheel. I'm hoping you all know all this, we have these, under what Bruce said in the very beginning, we have this other transactional authority that we turned into agreements called Space Acts. And that's our primary way of transferring this information. We have two primary kinds of Space Acts. One is we don't exchange any money. You can come to us because your research is important to missions that we have, and we want to see what you're doing, and we have things that you want to see what we're doing, and we help by working together. We'll do this non-reimbursable Space Act. We do quite a lot of those at NASA, from every center and from all across the agency. We also do this other thing that you should be very interested in, I hope you all know about, is that we have expertise at NASA in many areas, especially small companies and startups don't have expertise or can't afford the expertise that around everything they might need to do what their business case is putting forward. Well, you can come to NASA and you can tap into that expertise because we would like to transfer that technology to you. Or if we have a facility that you need, like a wind tunnel, because you probably don't want to build your own and maintain it, but you just need it for the beginning of your designs, you are allowed to reimburse us for the use of our wind tunnels. So when after watching what was happening and how the architectures were priorities kept changing, but we're still moving in the right direction, maybe not as fast as we'd like. And then this burgeoning new industry started up. And you could see it, coming around just from, in the last couple of 15 years or so, and it's gaining momentum exponentially. I wanted to be part of that and making sure that we could get these companies in a way that we could provide this kind of data in these facilities, and it's not been easy. Anyone that's at NASA will tell you that internally it's not easy. We're still trying to figure out, because we're not NACA. We are a different activity, and we've been in a different activity since most of us have been at NASA. And we're having to relearn this part of it. Now, we're not stopping our missions, or we're not stopping what our priorities are. Line, we can also help with industry. And we're slowly understanding how to do that. We've had many studies internally. We've been setting up a process internally about how we partner and how much of NASA's, and it has a lot to do with what the industry response is. So I would state that we're at the very beginning of this, and in the future we'll see a lot of changes. And it's interesting that, it's important that you take time to make comments and to talk to the agency about what is needed. And I think you'll see a positive response. With that, that's my statement.
Okay, good. So now we're getting into the fun part. So, geez, where do you go from here? So many juicy little topics to talk about. You got a comment?
No, just
a little timeline up on our wall of the history of the NACA on a timeline. It shows you from 1915 when it was formed and all the different aircraft and things. Like if you go back, one of the really cool things that the NACA did at the end of its life was the X-15, and that was a joint program with the Air Force. But there was a lot of morphing that was going on in this period. And so one of the questions is do we need to morph again? So let me ask you a question. So if you had to kind of typify, the NACA and how it differed from the NASA, particularly the Apollo program, one of the ways that we've kind of come in our office to look at that is where NACA was basically an industry-led and government-supported activity, where NASA is more of especially in Apollo, was a government-led and industry-supported activity. Now as we go into the 21st century, one, do you agree with that assessment? And two, how is NASA going to rise to the challenge that Jeff laid out there of providing some of this fundamental thing that may be complementary to what it's doing, but may not, keep doing that, foundational to NASA's exploration mission? But would it be useful to help establish this commercial space economy that Gary thinks, and we think as well, would be very, very beneficial to the broader community? So long question, but Michelle?
Is this on?
Yep.
Okay. So, let's see. I think that the purpose of Apollo was important in terms of national security. The activities that NACA started, the aviation industry, has clearly been economic engines of this nation. In thinking about how NACA and NASA have evolved over the decades, there has been a need to, and it's been difficult to balance the role of the agency and the expenditures within the agency, depending upon whether the nation is at war and there is applied research or vehicle building required, or whether the nation has been in a period of needing more fundamental research, and balancing those investments has been a challenge since I've been in the agency for over 20 years. I think that the need for the U.S. to lead in the peaceful uses of outer space continues to be an important national security issue, as well as an economic opportunity for this nation, increasingly so now that the space station is built, and like David said, we have The ISS Research and Development Conference last week had over 600 attendees. I haven't seen a conference like that since the AIAA Aerospace Sciences used to be over 1,000 at the Valleys in Reno.
Yep.
So, I mean, that is extremely encouraging. And if you look at the data coming out on the experiments being done in LEO and the interest in commercial use of LEO, combined with the COTS program and commercial crew, there is a huge opportunity there for this nation. There are, I think, evolving and maturing activities like Gary talked about in how to go beyond LEO, how to ensure peaceful use of outer space while opening up economic benefit. There are there are several technical and programmatic areas of interest in the entrepreneurial space within the U.S. that we're talking to within the Asteroid Redirect mission, but also maybe an opportunity for this kind of discussion that you're talking about.
Nice long question.
Thank you.
I think one of our big policy challenges in space right now is this false dichotomy between whether government or the private sector is the driver. The correct answer is both. And I say that as a fairly fierce private sector advocate. But you know, this experiment's been run. The experiment between state-run enterprise and private-run enterprise with government support has been run. We know which one works. You know, ask the Soviet Union. We know which one of these models works better. And I think there's a fear, a totally unjustified fear, but an understandable fear, that if we stop NASA being the actor, the doer of things in space, that A, we'll stop doing things in space, and B, NASA won't have anything to do. Just a couple of examples. We think there's water at the poles of the moon. That could be a game changer for everything we do in space. Where is it? What is it? What form is it in? Isn't that an interesting question? If only we had an agency that was chasing those kinds of things. Is there water on Phobos? Gee, if there was, that would completely revolutionize everything that you would do about how you would plan a Mars mission. It would completely invalidate everything we've done for 50 years thinking about how we would get to Mars. Interesting question. Maybe somebody should be looking at that. You know, people in laboratories have talked about doing magnetic shields for coming down from Earth orbit without the need for thermal protection. Gee, that could be a really interesting technology. Some experiments might need to be run. Gee, is a company going to do that? Probably not. It's going to take 5 or 10 years to figure out. By that point, the patents are going to run out. It's a darn shame we don't have an agency doing that kind of thing. You know, every single person currently at NASA and 10 times more over can be gainfully employed for the rest of their career answering these kinds of questions. And if we started answering these kinds of questions, the next time we do a flyby, it's going to be of an extrasolar planet. We have plenty to do, but my colleague on the end is dead right. The continuity of purpose that maintains the forward activity through administrations, through wars, through changes in policy, that comes from the private sector. We don't need a national car program to make sure we have cars next year. We don't need a national computer program to make sure we have computers next year. I'm pretty sure that if the government stops supporting cell phones, we'll still have cell phones next year. There are markets for those things. Bringing those technologies to the point where it is possible for people to make a market out of them is a perfectly appropriate, rational, productive, beneficial activity of government. NACA did it spectacularly well. I think NASA has within it the competencies to perform that role spectacularly well, but we have to charter them with doing it. And in a world of finite budgets, you have to make choices. If we use those resources to support the development of an aerospace industry, we will not use them to perform government-led missions in space. You gotta pick to be your primary point of emphasis.
Well, actually, Jeff made most of my favorite points, but it really is true. I think that, you know, when we're coming out of the age where the government was doing everything in space and that we had to look when industry interacted with us, it was to our requirements and to the way we do it. And we're going to look over your shoulder, and we're going to make sure it's exactly the way we want it. So now we're going to let industry advertise its abilities to launch things into space, to actually take crew there sometime, to build space stations. And we are going to buy from that, where we can go out and do the things, retire the risk on the things that are out there a decade ahead of time, or information. That is something. That is a wonderful role for government. And I actually see us moving. I mean, the agency in the last 15 years has moved tremendously in that direction. I would say that you would find most people that you talk to now on board with that. I was talking, Phil McAllister has some wonderful sets of charts. He was overseeing the COTS program about how we did things in the past and how we do things and what the strengths of that are. And we've already seen that. Because when industry gets involved, we see our own costs go down at NASA, and we can spend those funds doing the next things, retiring the risk on the next step, going to the moon, finding out about the water. We have done that. And so we can already, I think we have to be partners all the way along, and I'm really upbeat about us moving in that direction, and that we are moving in that direction.
At the risk of starting an argument, well, maybe that's good on the panel. Everything you said is true, and I agree with it. But I want to point out that there's one bridge yet ahead to cross, and that bridge yet ahead to cross is perhaps subconsciously, you still talk about it, and everybody else does too, as in how these partnerships can help NASA do its thing. Okay, the true change that the NACA mindset had is NACA's reason for being was not to do things. NACA's reason for being was to enable U.S. aerospace, U.S. aircraft and aerospace industry, and the U.S. defense establishment to do things that they both found useful to do. And NACA didn't, NACA had no missions to perform. Its mission was to help other people do their things better.
I'll just make one statement on that. So you're maybe, I'm not sure how I want to answer that. That doesn't sound but, so NASA, we've all been brought up. I've been with NASA over 25 years, and we were a mission agency. We think mission. There are missions that I don't think industry is going to do for us, especially in the science areas. And but there's parts of NASA that are exactly the way you describe, right? Our whole aeronautics program is with industry all the way. And so so you've got the whole gamut. And so I'll apologize, because I actually totally agree with you that the picture that we paint of enabling and doing it together as a partnership, I think is important. I think when I say we're doing missions, it's maybe doing those things that are reducing risk because that's just the language we use. And actually our guiding out into our long-term architectures is also industry can watch that and influence it. And so that it's more of a partnership all the way along. So I'm not arguing.
We got something going.
I think people in NASA still have a hard time saying, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. Which the NACA did, and people believe it. And they would also have a very difficult time saying effective government committee, but in fact, that was the essence of what the NACA was about. So to Bruce's point, is change possible? It is. The NACA changed dramatically from the 1930s when it was more military, university focused, to the post-war period when industry involvement became much more heavy. Primarily, the committee expanded from 12 members to 17, mostly from industry representatives who wanted to make sure that the work the NACA was doing would support them first before it supported the federal agencies. Change was also very evident in looking at the transition in NASA from 1958, 1962, and the Apollo era. The previous era, it was all about the von Braun,
Right.
measure sustainable expedition into space. And Apollo completely destroyed that, and NASA is still sort of living in the past of what Apollo was all about and coming through with its huge missions. Do I think NASA is ever going to be able to change that focus on large missions and sort of evolve away from the Apollo model? I'm not quite sure. There are a lot of things they can sort of do around the edges. Looking at patents and specifically having a more active internal report publication structure, I think is small things that would have a huge impact on the way that NASA is seen as an open source contributor to the developing space economy. Also I think there needs to be something more like the cable surveys that work so effectively in the science community to be at work in NASA. Look at things like the virtual institutes, Survey and the Astronaut Institute, and what a great job they're doing in sort of surveying the state of the art in exploration science and what questions need to be addressed, what they can say with any certainty about water on other bodies and what use that could be. For developing their own mission plans. Smaller, more constrained, but definitely things that would, in the long run, help NASA with its own missions.
Yeah. Sure.
I want to tell a short story from another industry because I think it's relevant to this experience that I had a little bit of personal awareness of, which was Semitech. The U.S. semiconductor industry was losing badly to the Japanese. We all remember those days, or maybe some of you don't if you look younger than that. The government came in and said, "We're here to help you." And they hired a staff, and they came in, and their thinking was, surely we, the government, can produce a better semiconductor process that we can then hand to you, the American industry, and you'll all be able to compete better with the Japanese. And it was a complete failure. Any one of the companies knew more about how to make a competitive semiconductor process, number one. Number two, no way are the companies going to give their crown jewels away to get to the government to make a better semiconductor process. That's what we used to keep competing. Nevertheless, Semitech turned out to be very effective because it abandoned that line of thinking and instead went out to industry and said, what is it that you need in order to be more competitive? And the answer was, well, one of the reasons we're losing to the Japanese is that the Japanese also have the semiconductor equipment manufacturer. So they get the first access to all of the latest and greatest tools and toys. And we don't get to start playing with them until after the Japanese already have processes for working on that. So this is a theme you'll hear again. Semitech started developing common standards and common needs and said, if IBM and Intel and AMD and all the other companies can agree on what kind of lithography machines they need, there'll be a critical mass of purchasers and they can go get the latest and greatest stuff because they will then have the same purchasing power collectively that the Japanese have because they're effectively government backed. And it worked magnificently. But again, that magnificent success was achieved because of the change of orientation from, is the government the doer, or is the government there to facilitate the doing that is taking place in the private sector? And I've never forgotten that model, and I think there are lessons learned for how we can make this work effectively in the future.
And I think to follow that, I thought the interesting thing about Semitech too was that at some point, the industry invited the government to exit.
Yes.
Yeah, and the government did, and went off to do other things. Michelle.
So I think one distinction there is that in Semitech's case, the market was right there. And in some of the areas where we're trying to deal with in NASA, the market is either a near future market or a very strategic potential market. At least the areas that I'm dealing in are the strategic potential market type futures, and those are less difficult to immediately quantify value on, and therefore, more difficult, So that was my.
So let me follow that up with a shorter question. NASA has been using an intriguing new word in the last year or two, and that's pioneering. And so what does that imply to you? And it seems to me that that's very helpful in maybe making this transition into this new way of doing things. Because if you take the mission orientation that we've had historically, and now you expand that out to more of a pioneering, which implies infrastructure, which implies reusability, that we're going to go do this more than once, you know, is that a step in the right direction? And if so, how do we help that along?
Let's see.
I didn't say it was easy, I just said it was short.
Yeah, I actually, I think this whole, it is kind of answered by our question, what we just talked about, especially what Michelle talked about, because I've been working with her on ARM, and we're looking at industries that it's hard to show, what your value chain is going to be when your business case is going to come true. But in the long term, if civilization's moving off this planet and maybe 50 years, maybe less, and we're going to have permanent bases on the moon, and someday permanent bases on Mars, and this is and you believe in that destiny, then the markets are, unbelievably infinity about how much money can be made, because the people who are living on the moon are going to want a beer and some entertainment when they get home, and they're going to want all the creature comforts, and they're going to want everything they have while they're there at the base, or maybe even they're there for longer periods. So when do you start making money on that? And if you're an industry that looks at mining and 3D printing and creating because you're not going to bring it from Earth. You're going to have to make it in space. You're going to have to learn how to make it there. So there's all these new techniques that are coming online now, synthetic biology to get things there that you want to recreate. So to me, NASA is kind of leading the way on this, and it gets back to reducing risk. I think because the business cases aren't there. There aren't people living on the moon, and there's a maybe chicken and the egg thing or whatever. But somebody's got to make those investments, because the companies need to come into an infrastructure where their business case is accepted by the people who are going to be the investors, and it's realistic. And that, I think, NASA plays a big role, especially as we move off this planet.
I'm all in favor of the word pioneering, especially if it kills the word precursor. Precursor as a word, as a concept, is something that's fairly recent, within the past 10, 20 years. If you ask people today what the precursors to Apollo were, they most likely would say Ranger, Surveyor, Orbiter. You ask people at the time, and they probably would have said, which were the spacecraft that landed on the moon, for those of you too young to remember. If you ask people at the time, they would have said Mercury, Gemini, because they established the infrastructure for human exploration. But in fact, in the 1960s, nobody used the word precursor. You could do a Google search, and the only time it came up was a chemist who, in chemistry, precursor has a different meaning. It's an element that's transformed to something else. It's not a step you take to verify knowledge so that you can then move forward. And as an historian, the word precursor is especially dangerous because it implies you know where you're going. It implies that you're doing something as a step to something else. Sometimes that's true. Sometimes there are types of knowledge and types of technology that need to be tested out before you could make an investment in something longer. But you could also make the argument that, in the timescales we're looking at in space exploration, 20 years or so for the missions that we've been talking about to come to fruition, we don't know that those are ever going to happen. The only way you can say something is a precursor is looking at it retrospectively, not prospectively. And I think NASA needs to start pioneering. That is just sending stuff out, bending metals, shooting things, or asking the industry what they can do with that pioneering technology in a very broad, aggressively generalized sense.
I love that. As you can tell, I'm not a big advocate of the centrally planned model. There's the pretense of knowledge that we know exactly what needs to be happening, and we know what the mission to Mars is going to look like, so we know what technologies are needed. So, so if we go do those, that's great. Those companies that are working on that, we'll be glad to let them help us. And none of it's true. You know, I don't know when we're going to get when human beings are going to set foot on Mars. The one thing I do know is it won't look like the RM5. And if, in order for the government assistance and support of industries that did things that are strategically useful, and aerospace for good reasons for being strategically useful, is done more by doing a sort of a gap analysis. You know, what problems do people have? You know, I agree that the business case for these things is very, very far out, and obviously you can't just leave it to the private sector alone. It won't happen really. But you could go to the private sector companies that are looking at putting business plans together in that, to pick one example, and say, what problems do you have? What don't you know? And that would be a useful guide for things that we might want to do. And we might be very surprised. You know, or maybe you've done that already.
We actually, a couple years ago, in June 2013, released an RFI for our mission and did ask for ideas to come in on potential partnerships. And then we actually had a broad area announcement where we asked for small dollar level potential contracts to flesh out some of these ideas and potential partnerships. And we did get some really strong results from two entrepreneurial companies that are interested in this long-term future and institute resource utilization. And so we're still, you know, this is a strategic activity, exactly how to fold that into our plans, but also fold our plans into that thinking. And it's complicated, and it is a marathon. It's not a 100-yard dash. But I do appreciate the comment and resonate with that as well.
So let me ask one final question, and then I'll open it up to the folks here, to the audience. Yeah, you folks out there. So if you go back to one of Jeff's previous experiences, which was the Augustine Committee, and this whole idea of the flexible path, and then the Obama administration tried to roll that out, and it was not terribly well received. This idea of let's spend a few years developing the technology and laying this new foundation, bringing the technology up to date, and then we'll figure out how we want to do that. It was not terribly well received in Congress, and so we went back. But remember, this was before the COTS program had played out at all, the Commercial Orbital Transportation Services, much less commercial crew. So now, you know, we're much further down the ride. We have some more experience about how this works. Do you think it's worth, you know, basically looking at that, again, this whole flexible, you know, path kind of concept, especially with what the private sector is trying to do? If you go back to one of the questions that was asked of Dava, you know, what's NASA going to do if when they get to Mars, you know, Elon or somebody else is already there? And, you know, is that going to be a little bit awkward?
I really appreciate the softball question at the end. Okay. National activities of every type are funded not because they're good ideas. They may be good ideas, but that's not why they're funded. They're funded because there are stakeholders. The existing stakeholder of NASA is NASA, and the employees of NASA, and the supporting contractors of NASA, and the prime contractors that perform NASA missions, and their network of subcontractors. That's essentially the only politically significant stakeholder of NASA today. I wasn't politically active during Apollo, so I can't tell you from my own experience whether the American taxpayer ever was or wasn't viewed as a stakeholder, but they're not now. So if NASA is going to do anything, firstly, that's a very limited pool of stakeholders, and it's not a growing pool of stakeholders. So if you want to know why NASA's budget never seems to go up, that's why. It's not serving any new stakeholders. The pie is not getting any bigger. If you want NASA to do something either different or bigger than it's doing now, that different, bigger thing has to serve other stakeholders. That's part of what I think the importance that was touched on of what the partnership model is. You know, I've been critical of it only because I don't think it's a bridge far enough, but it's absolutely in the right direction. That is starting to broaden the base. New companies and new congressional districts, new employees are suddenly interested in new things that NASA is doing, and that makes those programs hard to kill politically, because all of a sudden some congressman who never knew they had space in his district has space in his district. Major changes in government agencies usually only happen in response to catastrophic events. So, no, I wouldn't do. Something's going to have to happen that makes the maintenance of the current model politically untenable. Landing on Mars and finding that either Elon or the a spectacular advance that shows that a different model from what we've been doing is having more interesting results than the model we've been pursuing, eventually might raise that question. The other thing that might raise that question is the pool of government non-defense discretionary spending is getting more and more constrained. It's likely to get more and more constrained for the foreseeable future for various demographic reasons. And so at some point, the model we're on is going to break. I think obviously it would be better to, which is going to come whether we like it or not, but I don't think it's going to happen entirely from inside. I think it's something's going to happen from outside. Gary?
Well, I know some of the things I might say sound like I'm different, and I am in some respect, but not totally. But for instance, I think when you say that NASA's for NASA's itself, you're talking maybe about a very sliver of NASA, because in the science areas we're with the academic community, and that's huge, and maybe the world academic community, and with aeronautics, it's all about industry, and all about new industries coming up with UAVs and everything. It's very active, trying to enable new businesses working very closely, and they're not mission oriented. You have areas that they're moving out in. I think it's when you get into deep space missions and humans, in particular, that you're right in a way. But I think what Michelle said is a very important point. And I think the Symantec response that Michelle had, the business isn't there. NASA's not competing with business plans that exist. And there's actually a policy, at least in the transportation area, that we will not compete. We can debate things about that. But the whole thing is that we are, to me, by reducing some of the risk and by spending the kind of money we are to move that far out, will enable new business plans. And I like the idea that we would do that in partnership with industry. Maybe, and now that I believe we are in a period of change where we would allow more input from industry to help decide together how those long-term investments will be made.
So, well, go ahead.
All right, just on the notion of the flexible path, I'm all in favor of that. I see how many architectures and mission studies, lie on library bookshelves, getting dusty, and it's the historian's job to figure out which one of those many ambiguous statements actually resulted in something that looked like hardware and achieve some sort of success. The flexible path needs to be very aggressively protected. And just two analogies there. You mentioned COTS, and COTS is frequently described as an analogy with what the airmail industry was going through in the late 1920s. There were enormous subsidies, which of course I'm sure everybody in the space industry today would like to see in developing the technology, is that in fact it would be flexible, that Many different types of routes would require different sort of aircraft. They were developing technology that could be used for all of this. But the subsidy, and because there was not that protection until the law changed in 1934, resulted in massive consolidation in the industry. I mean, there are only two major ML carriers which owned most of the aircraft production at the time. It was a bad model, it required an act of Congress, and people going to jail to change that. And then you look at how the space shuttle was described in the late 1960s, early 1970s. There again, I mean, that was a space truck. It was a flexible model. It was a tool that could be used to back on the von Braun paradigm, but to do all sorts of things in space, get huge military satellites up there, build a space station. And in the end, because the shuttle was not protected as a flexible path to getting into low Earth orbit and then perhaps that mission largely became all about the shuttle. After a few years, it became all about building a space station, all of which was fine, but the idea of a flexible path, because there were no stakeholders to protect it, sort of vanished.
Okay, let's open it up to, so if you get queue up to the microphone if you have a question. If you can keep it like me, that would be great. Yeah.
If we want NASA to act like NACA with respect to human spaceflight, the industry has to have a market. And the only market I can think of is tourism. This is an enormous market. So two parts to the question. One, is there anything else for human spaceflight? And second, what should NASA be doing to act like NACA to support space tourism?
There are a virtually unlimited list of things that you can do in space, just like on the ground. And labor is useful as a factor of production in many of them. The problem is right now the cost of on-orbit labor is greater than the economic value that it can produce in almost all circumstances. That will not persist indefinitely. Therefore, if you were asking the question, what technologies do we lack that enable a greatly expanded use of human labor as a factor of space production, the answer would be it's probably easier to shift the cost side of the equation than it is to make it more valuable. And so we should be looking at any array of technologies that makes the cost of putting human beings on orbit and keeping them there and beyond lower.
And I'll just add, I really like that answer. When we were first talking about going to the moon, Mars, and beyond, one of the things that kept coming up was that question. Because we were focused on doing science in space. The whole program was focused on doing science. So you had to say that you needed humans to do that because they were better than robots. But the fact is they probably aren't in many respects. And it's a lot more expensive to take a human system there. And if you can, especially now with robotics and autonomy growing at the way it is, they certainly won't be in the future. So it's really not that question. I like where Jeff put it. It's really something else about human experience and about the future of humanity and where we want to be. And we can get in case, or should we spread ourselves out, or are there people who want to be away from the society and live in another place? Those things are always talked about also. So it's a very difficult question to ask depending on the parameters you ask for.
2 points. One, I personally really resonate with the Neil deGrasse Tyson findings that there are 3 major drivers historically for sustainable human exploration. The first is war. Second, praise of deity. Third, promise of economic return. Not guaranteed economic return, but promise of economic return. And so if you look at the frameworks or basis upon which there could be economic return, I would say NASA's very engaged in defining risk, which helps companies to evaluate, as well as reducing risk, like Larry said earlier. I already forgot my second point, so.
I'm not sure I know the answer to what NASA's doing to support space tourism, but I would ask you back. I'm sorry? Okay, well, first of all, we could ask you what we could do to support space tourism. I'm not sure that you made any effort as an industry to tell NASA. I think where I would look. Okay, okay, I'm sorry. So NASA has a very vibrant and diverse set of research efforts going on there that I think could be helpful in space tourism, and NASA's doing one of the things it's always done best, which is inspiring the next generation of explorers. You know, the tweets that are coming back from the space station, you know, with the new high-definition technologies, I think are doing a remarkable job in convincing people that really there's something spectacular about being able to tourism.
I'd like to get in one more question here, so before we go, because I'm about to get the, yeah.
I was just going to ask a general question with a couple sub-points.
Quickly, please.
Okay. Is there an existing sort of global ACA? It seems that this whole panel's
What's ACA?
advisory committee.
Advisory committee for.
Yeah. How close would it be beneficial to have one? How close are we? And if not, and it is beneficial, how would we go about starting one in terms of getting the global aerospace industry working together to get humanity to do these cool missions and stuff?
I don't think it's close. I believe in competition, so I think that's probably a good thing.
And NASA does have an advisory committee that you know, reports to the administrator, and you know, we cycle people through. So there is a mechanism for that, but it's not as global or as broadly based as there was back in the NACA days.
Well, there is a international group of people putting together a roadmap for human exploration. And so they've been together for many years, and that's about as close as we get. So the agencies that are interested in human exploration do get together. They've created a joint roadmap, but that's about as far as it goes. I mean, each of them are looking at what their pieces will be in the future.
Yeah, that's the International Space Exploration Coordination Group. Yeah. Anyway, I'm getting the hook here. So anyway, help me thank my panel. Thank you very much. Finally, the Flight Research Center down at in Mojave. But there were some challenges as well. So what we'd like to do in this panel is to look back at kind of the last 100 years and say, what have we learned in this period of time? What happened, the good, the bad, you know, the not so good, and what can we learn from that as we go forward? And then, you know, in 1958, when NASA was established by Congress, they rolled pretty much all of NACA, all of NACA into NASA, and so NASA was kind of built around the kernel of this previous organization, and they carried over some things. And one thing that I want to do that Gary's going to talk about at the end here, and there was one little line in the NASA authorization. It was kind of a throwaway line at the end that was very important for what we're trying to do right now, and it's called Other Transactions Authority. So what Congress gave to NACA or to NASA, which at the time no other government agency had, was this Other Transactions Authority. When a contract or a grant was not appropriate, NASA had the ability to use this Other Transactions Authority. And so we're going to talk about what that has enabled and what we've been able to do with that. So what we're going to do is we're going to go kind of off with Glenn Bugos, is the historian at NASA Ames in the history office at NASA Ames, and he's going to give us kind of the background of this. Then we're going to have Dr. Michelle Gates, is the program director of the Asteroid Redirect mission at NASA headquarters, and she's going to talk about some of the innovative things that they're trying to do with that mission, and kind of look at new ways of doing things to try to bring these kinds of exciting missions about. Then we're going to have Jeff Grayson, who's the co-founder and chairman of the board of XCore Aerospace, and a very thoughtful person in these matters. And so I was really glad that Jeff agreed to be here, because I know he's done a lot of thinking on this, and he actually still uses the NASA TMs and the NACA TMs that came out in the in the olden days as part of his company. And finally, Gary Martin is the director of the partnership directorate at NASA Ames. And he's going to talk about some of the exciting things that are going on right now and some of the new things that NASA is trying to do to enhance partnerships in the way that industry, government, and academia can work together better. So on that note, I'm going to turn it over to Glenn, and we'll get this started. So we're going to do some brief presentations from this. I'm going to start off with some questions, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. So hope you enjoy. Get my panel. Jeff Grayson. We sell it on flight. So since we're going to go ahead and jump in here. My name is Bruce Pittman. So I'm the Chief System Engineer at the Space Portal at the NASA Ames Research Center. And I'm going to moderate the panel this morning. And we have an interesting topic to talk about. So I want to give you a little history lesson. So I'm going to start off, and then Glenn's going to fill in the details here. But I want to take you back 100 years. March 3rd, 1915. A long time ago. A lot of changes happened since then. So back then, there was the 63rd Congress was coming to an end. It would end the next day. And so there was a rider that was attached to the Navy Appropriations Bill that year, which had this thing called the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, and with a grand total budget of $5,000. And this was authorized for 5 years for a group of 12 individuals that would report to the president and advise him on the aeronautics in the United States. And the situation was, in 1903, another history lesson, December 17, 1903, the Wright brothers, Kitty Hawk, first heavier than air flight with a person. Okay, so you're saying, hey, this is a big deal. That must have changed the world. Nada, nothing, zip. One, it was slightly some part of the paranoia of the Wright brothers, but it was also, since the government-funded program, which was Samuel P. Langley, had ended up in the Potomac right before that, everybody had gotten kind of turned off to aviation. And so the U.S. government didn't buy the first airplanes for almost 5 years. And it was 1908 before we bought the first airplanes. And then I think we bought 2. Well, the Wright brothers, were a little bit frustrated by this. And so what they did is they went over to Europe. So in 1908, they took off for Europe. They got invited over there, and so they went over and flew around Paris. And that took the continent by storm. The Europeans were very excited about this and very open to this. And so the next year in 1909, the British started 2 things. One was the British Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, and the British Royal Aircraft Factory were both set up. And that kind of set the pace in Europe for what was going on. And so fast forward to 1912-ish period, a lot of people were looking at what's going on in Europe and saying, hey, we're behind. We're losing our edge here if or we've already lost it. And so the question was, what do we do about it? So that's what led to the foundation of the NACA. By the time World War I started, which was in July 1914, we were hopelessly behind. The Europeans, the British, the Russians, and everybody had been putting far more money and everything into aircraft than we were. And so the NACA was established to help answer that challenge. Make America get back into the game, become a world leader again, and fundamentally understand both the science and the technology of aeronautics and flight. And so, as I said, Glenn's going to give us the details of that. But And it was successful. The NACA was able to do a lot of really incredible things, both on the management side. One of the things that had greatly inhibited this development in America was this big patent fight between the Wright brothers and Glenn Curtiss that kind of brought everything to a halt, so that the NACA helped broker this deal with what this establishment was called the Manufacturers Aircraft Association, and a cross-licensing agreement there, and a royalty fee arrangement that kind of broke that logjam and really allowed for innovation to come back to the United States. And so they had some real successes with both the technology and with things like fundamental aerodynamics and the airfoils and cowlings and everything that they applied to aircraft navigation, weather, and particularly icing was a big problem back in those days. And the NACA did a tremendous amount of work in those areas. And laboratories were established. First, the Langley Laboratory in Hampton, Virginia in 1920, then Ames in 1939, and then what was called the Lewis Research Center in 1940, and then finally...
Morning. I hope y'all enjoyed your coffee. Mayor Sam Liccardo is the 65th mayor of San Jose, elected in November of 2014. I recently finished reading the book, If Mayors Ruled the World. Barber asserts that cities and the mayors who run them are primary incubators of the innovations that shape our planet and our universe. Mayor Liccardo has cultivated innovation in science, technology, and education in San Jose with programs like 1,000 Hearts for 1,000 Minds, and continues to support efforts like the NewSpace conference that are helping to drive the space renaissance in this city and in the world. Please join me in welcoming Mayor Sam Liccardo.
Thank you, Hannah, and thank you, and good morning. It's great to see folks here for the 8th year now of this conference in San Jose, and we're thrilled to host you. We love having you, and we love having your tax dollars, so please stay here and spend lots of money. This has been a really exciting time, I understand, in the space industry, and I think many of you know of the roots of this industry here in the Valley. Back in the day when there was a lot of federal money in this, clearly the industry has transformed now, and it's primarily a private sector venture, and that's where Silicon Valley certainly does best, and that's where San Jose has done best. We are thrilled to have many great companies here in San Jose that have been deeply involved over the last few years in forging new frontiers. And I just want to thank Hannah and all the folks who put this effort together. We know this is an exciting time. We want San Jose to be in the middle of this. Our great companies are here doing incredible things, and we want to support them. And if you just happen to have a company that's looking for a home, don't hesitate to give us a call, and we'll help you find a space to scale here in San Jose, in a place where you'll be among the most innovative minds in the world. Please have a wonderful conference. We look forward to great things happening from the collection of minds right here. Have a great day.
Thanks, Bruce. That was actually a great introduction to the history of the NACA. So show of hands, how many people in here had actually heard of the NACA before Bruce mentioned it? That's great. Actually, the numbers of engineers that know about the NACA is probably greater than the number of historians, because the technical reports are still in such wide use. So because it's the centenary of the NACA, the NASA history community is taking this opportunity to sort of ask the question about whether or not the NACA, as they say in Lion King, still lives in you. It's a cause to reflect on the culture of the NACA and whether or not there is a legacy of it within NASA today. So the NACA lasted a fairly short period of time, 43 years, from 1915 to 1958, and it's been gone longer than that, almost 57 years. Yet it lives, I think, in memory and in legacy, because it embodies some essential government functions that can hide in other organizations, that can never completely go away as long as there is space to explore and people to make money doing so. So here's a quick history. Bruce mentioned its humble beginnings. The word committee in its name was actually very meaningful throughout its lifetime, but especially during World War I, when the advisory in the name was also very meaningful. Of the 12 members, 12 of them came, of the 12 members in the NACA committee, half of them were from the military services or other government agencies related to aircraft like the Weather Bureau or the National Bureau of Standards. The other half were academic experts. The military came with questions about why their aircraft were underperforming, and the other members advised them on a specific solution. They did some important contracted studies, as with William Durand at Stanford University, who did a parameter variation study on the effectiveness of propellers. The NACA opened its first laboratory in 1920 in Langley, Virginia, and soon the NACA became associated with wind tunnels and other great experimental facilities. By the late 1920s, the culture of the NACA shifted. The policy business was turned over to the Commerce Department, and the NACA began focusing more on assessing and advancing the state-of-the-art in aircraft technology. The NACA support of airmail reflects this transition. Early on, the NACA advocated airmail as a top government priority, as a killer app for getting the industry started. The Army started airmail with disastrous results. The Post Office took over in 1918. By 1924, they were flying airmail around the clock, coast to coast, and with the best safety record of any air operation. That's the